Hello, and welcome to Lyla's Lullabies, where we spend time exploring with Lyla, a traveler who wanders the world at her own pace, while sharing her most enriching and restorative moments with you. In tonight's story, we'll follow Lyla as she explores the beautiful Scottish city of Edinburgh. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself go. We're so glad you're here. Whenever you're ready, let's begin. The train pulled into Waverley Station just as the morning light began to soften the gray stone buildings that rose up on either side of the tracks. Lyla gathered her small backpack and stepped onto the platform, feeling the cool air settle around her shoulders. July in Edinburgh still held a certain crispness, especially at this early hour, and she was glad she'd brought a light cardigan. The station hummed with quiet activity. A few travelers wheeled luggage across the smooth floors, their footsteps echoing under the vast glass roof. Somewhere nearby, the smell of fresh coffee drifted from a cafe that was just opening its shutters. Lyla paused for a moment, orienting herself, then made her way toward the exit. As she climbed the steps that led up from the station, the city began to reveal itself. The buildings here were tall and elegant, their sandstone facades stained darker in places by centuries of weather. She emerged onto Princes Street and stopped, taking in the view that stretched before her. To her right, the gardens sloped downward in a ribbon of green, separating the busy street from the old town that rose dramatically on the far side. And there, commanding the skyline, sat Edinburgh Castle, perched on its volcanic rock, as if it had always been there, as if it had grown from the stone itself. The morning sun caught the edges of its walls, turning them golden. Lyla decided to begin her day with a walk through Princes Street Gardens. She crossed the street and descended into the park, where the grass was still damp with dew. The pathways wound between flower beds bursting with summer color, bright pink roses, purple lavender, cheerful orange marigolds. A few early joggers passed her, their breath visible in the cool air, and she nodded hello to an older man walking a small terrier. The gardens were peaceful at this hour. She could hear birds calling to one another from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, the faint rumble of a bus making its way along the street above. A jogger passed, moving with the kind of determined optimism that suggested this was possibly his first run in several months. Lyla followed a path that curved beneath tall trees, their leaves creating a canopy of dappled light. She found a bench facing the castle and sat down for a few minutes, simply watching. A woman in a blue raincoat walked past, speaking on her phone in a soft Scottish accent. I'll meet you at the cafe around 9, she was saying. No, take your time. I'll just have a wee coffee while I wait. Lyla smiled to herself. There was something comforting about the rhythm of the voice, the gentle roll of the words. She stayed on the bench a little longer, then rose and continued her walk through the gardens, eventually climbing back up to street level near the Scott Monument. The monument towered above her, a Gothic spire of intricate stone rising into the sky like a piece of elaborate lacework. She'd read that it was dedicated to Sir Walter Scott, the writer, and that visitors could climb the narrow spiral staircase inside. Lyla tilted her head back, following the monument's height with her eyes, then decided she'd rather keep her feet on the ground today. There was something satisfying about simply admiring it from below, taking in the details of the carvings without rushing. She made her way along the pavement, passing shops that were just beginning to open. A man in an apron was arranging postcards on a rack outside a tourist shop, and the scent of fresh pastries wafted from a bakery door propped open with a wooden wedge. Lyla's stomach reminded her that she hadn't eaten since the evening before, so she stepped inside. The bakery was small and warm, with a glass counter displaying rows of golden pastries, fruit tarts, and thick slices of shortbread. Behind the counter, a young woman with her hair tied back in a ponytail greeted her cheerfully. "Morning, what can I get you?" Lyla studied the options for a moment. "I'll have a butter croissant, please, and a tea." "Milk and sugar?" "Just the tea, thank you." The woman wrapped the croissant in paper and poured tea from a large pot into a to-go cup. Lyla paid, added a splash of milk from the small jug on the counter, and stepped back outside. She walked slowly, sipping her tea and tearing off small pieces of the croissant as she went. It was flaky and rich, melting on her tongue. Her plan was to wander without too much structure, letting the city guide her. She turned onto a side street that sloped upward, leading her into the old town. The buildings here were older, their stone darkened with age, and the streets narrowed as she climbed. Lyla passed a small bookshop with a wooden sign hanging above the door, and a pub with flower boxes in the windows, not yet open for the day. The street opened into a wider lane, and she realized she'd reached the Royal Mile. Even at this early hour, it had a certain energy. A few tour groups were beginning to gather near the entrance to a close, and a bagpiper in full Highland dress was setting up his instrument near a lamp-post. Lyla walked slowly, taking in the shop fronts, tartan scarves and woolen blankets displayed in windows, shops selling whiskey and tablet, a small gallery showing paintings of the Scottish Highlands. She paused in front of a shop selling Edinburgh rock, the old-fashioned candy that crumbled lightly when you bit into it. Through the window, she could see jars of it in pastel colors: pink, lemon yellow, mint green. A handwritten sign propped against one jar said, "Made fresh daily." Lyla continued up the Royal Mile, her pace unhurried. The cobblestones were uneven beneath her feet, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. She passed the entrance to Mary King's Close, where a tour guide was already speaking to a small group about the hidden streets that lay beneath the city. Lyla listened for a moment. Something about plague and history, and the everyday lives of people who'd lived here hundreds of years ago. But she didn't join the tour. Today she wanted to stay above ground, in the sunlight. Near the top of the Royal Mile, she reached the forecourt of Edinburgh Castle. The esplanade stretched wide and open, and she could see the castle's entrance gate ahead, flanked by statues. A few visitors were already queuing for tickets, but Lyla decided she'd rather admire the castle from the outside. She'd learned long ago that some of her best travel experiences came from simply observing, rather than ticking off every official attraction. Besides, the queue looked like it contained at least 3 tour groups, and she could already hear a guide's amplified voice explaining the history of the honours of Scotland in emphatic detail. She walked to the edge of the esplanade and looked out over the city. From here, the view was breathtaking. She could see the rooftops of the old town spreading below, the spires of churches rising among them, and, beyond that, the newer parts of the city, with their Georgian terraces and green spaces. In the distance, She could just make out the blue line of the Firth of Forth, the water glinting in the sunlight. A breeze picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of the sea. Lyla stood there for a while, letting the wind cool her face. Then she turned and made her way back down the Royal Mile, taking a different route this time, exploring the smaller closes and wynds that branched off from the main street. One narrow passageway led her down a steep set of stone steps, the buildings on either side leaning in so close that she could almost touch both walls at once. The steps were worn in the middle, dipped by the passage of countless feet over the years. At the bottom, she emerged into a quiet courtyard surrounded by old tenement buildings. Washing hung from a few windows, and a cat sat on a doorstep, cleaning its paws. Lyla felt as if she'd stepped back in time. The courtyard was peaceful, undisturbed by the bustle of the street above. She crossed it slowly, her footsteps soft, and found another set of steps leading down. These brought her to the grass market, a wide-open square surrounded by shops and cafes. The grass market had a different feel, more relaxed, more lived in. The cobblestones here were lighter in color, and the buildings painted in shades of cream and terracotta. A few people sat outside a cafe, their faces turned toward the sun, and the smell of bacon and eggs drifted from an open kitchen window. Lyla wandered along the edge of the square, looking in shop windows. There was a vintage clothing store with dresses from the 1950s displayed on mannequins, a bookshop specializing in Scottish history, and a small chocolatier with handmade truffles arranged in neat rows. She stepped into the chocolatier, drawn by the rich smell of cocoa. Inside, the shop was cool and dim, the walls lined with shelves of chocolate bars wrapped in elegant paper. A man behind the counter looked up and smiled. "Feel free to have a look around," he said. "We've got samples on the counter if you'd like to try anything." Lyla thanked him and moved slowly along the shelves, reading the labels. Dark chocolate with sea salt, milk chocolate with honeycomb, white chocolate with raspberry. She picked up a small bar of dark chocolate infused with whiskey and took it to the counter. "Good choice," the man said as he wrapped it. "That one's made with a single malt from Islay, just a hint of peat." Lyla tucked the chocolate into her bag and stepped back outside. The sun was climbing higher now, warming the stones beneath her feet. She decided to head toward the Meadows, a large park she'd read about, hoping for a quiet place to sit for a while. She decided to find somewhere to eat before heading to the Meadows. She followed a series of streets that led away from the old town, passing rows of Georgian townhouses with their neat front steps and black railings. After a few minutes of wandering, she spotted a cozy-looking pub with flower boxes in the windows and a chalkboard sign outside that read, "Homemade soup and fresh sandwiches." Inside, the pub was warm and inviting, with dark wood paneling and framed photographs of old Edinburgh lining the walls. A handful of locals sat at the bar, chatting quietly over pints, and a few tables were occupied by people enjoying their lunch. Lyla chose a small table near the window and picked up the menu. A cheerful waiter with ginger hair and an impressive collection of freckles appeared at her table. "Afternoon, what can I get you?" Lyla scanned the menu. "What's the soup today?" "Cullen skink," he said. "It's a Scottish smoked haddock chowder. Absolutely brilliant if I do say so myself, though I didn't make it, so I'm allowed to say that." He winked. Lyla smiled. "That sounds perfect. I'll have that. And maybe a half sandwich? Cheese and pickle? Ham and mustard? Or we've got a rather enthusiastic amount of roast beef on offer today. The chef got a bit carried away with the slicing. I'll go with the cheese. No pickle, please. Sure. Anything to drink? Just water, thank you. He returned a few minutes later with a steaming bowl of creamy soup, flecked with pieces of fish and potato, and a generous half sandwich on crusty bread. The soup smelled incredible, smoky and rich, and Lyla dipped her spoon in immediately. The first taste was warming and comforting, the kind of food that seemed designed specifically for Scottish weather, even on a relatively mild July day. The fish was tender, the broth silky, and there was a subtle hint of leek running through it. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, alternating with bites of the sandwich. At the next table, two older women were deep in conversation about someone's garden gnome collection, which had apparently grown to an alarming size. 47 gnomes, Margaret. 47. Where does it end? One of them was saying, with the kind of dramatic exasperation that suggested she was secretly delighted by the whole situation. Lyla found herself smiling as she finished her soup, mopping up the last of the broth with a piece of bread. The waiter returned to collect her bowl. How was it? Delicious, Lyla said. Definitely worth the immodest praise. He grinned. I'll pass that along to the chef. She'll be chuffed. After settling her bill, Lyla stepped back outside, feeling pleasantly satisfied and ready to continue her explorations. The streets here were quieter, more residential, with trees lining the pavements. She passed a small corner shop where an older woman was buying a newspaper, and a cafe with tables outside where a couple sat reading the morning paper together. Eventually, the buildings gave way to open space, and Lyla found herself at the edge of the Meadows. The park stretched wide before her, a vast expanse of green dotted with trees. Pathways crisscrossed the grass, and she could see people walking dogs, cycling, or simply lying on the grass with books. Lyla chose a path that led beneath an avenue of trees. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. She walked slowly, enjoying the feeling of grass and earth beneath her feet instead of stone. After a while, she found a bench beneath an old oak tree and sat down. From here, she could see across the park to the buildings on the far side, their rooftops just visible above the treetops. A group of students sat in a circle on the grass nearby, laughing and sharing a bag of crisps. A man threw a tennis ball for his retriever, the dog bounding joyfully after it. Lyla leaned back against the bench and closed her eyes for a moment, listening. She could hear the rustling of leaves, the distant chatter of voices, the occasional bark of a dog. A light breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of cut grass. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed a small path leading off to the side, barely visible between two hedges. Curious, she stood and followed it. The path was narrow and overgrown in places, wildflowers growing along the edges. It led her to a quieter section of the park, where fewer people ventured. Here, she found a small pond, its surface covered with lily pads. A heron stood at the edge, perfectly still, watching the water. Lyla stopped walking, not wanting to disturb it. For several minutes, she and the heron simply existed in the same space, both quiet, both still. Then, with a sudden movement, The heron spread its wings and lifted off, gliding low over the water before disappearing into the trees. Lyla smiled. She stayed by the pond a little longer, then made her way back to the main path and continued her walk through the meadows. Eventually, she found herself on the far side of the park, near a row of cafes and small restaurants. One cafe caught her eye, a small place with mismatched chairs on the pavement and chalkboard menus leaning against the wall. Through the window, she could see shelves lined with jars of homemade jam and bottles of local lemonade. She went inside. The interior was cozy, with wooden tables and soft lighting. A few people sat reading or working on laptops, and quiet music played in the background, something jazzy and mellow. Lyla approached the counter, where a woman with silver hair and bright red glasses greeted her. "What can I get you, love?" "I'll have a pot of tea, please," Lyla said. "And maybe a scone?" "Plain or fruit?" "Fruit, please." "Lovely. I'll bring it over to you." "Just take a seat anywhere." Lyla chose a table by the window, where she could watch the street outside. A few minutes later, the woman brought over a tray with a small teapot, a cup, and a warm scone with butter and jam on the side. "There you go. Enjoy." Lyla poured the tea and let it steep for a moment. The scone was still warm, crumbling slightly as she spread butter and raspberry jam across it. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, and sipped her tea while watching people pass by the window. Two women paused outside the cafe, chatting. One of them was holding a bouquet of sunflowers, bright and cheerful against her dark jacket. They spoke in animated tones, their words muffled by the glass but their laughter clear. After a moment, they hugged and went their separate ways. When Lyla had finished her tea, she paid at the counter and stepped back outside. The afternoon was well underway now, and the streets had grown busier. She decided to explore Stockbridge, a neighborhood she'd heard was charming and a bit off the usual tourist path. She walked north, crossing a bridge over the Water of Leith, a small river that wound through the city. Below, the water flowed gently over smooth stones, and she could see a path running alongside it, shaded by trees. She made a mental note to walk along it later if she had time. Stockbridge greeted her with narrow streets lined with independent shops. There was a cheese shop with wheels of cheese stacked in the window, a second-hand bookshop with crates of books spilling onto the pavement, and a small deli selling fresh bread and olives. Lyla wandered from shop to shop, not buying anything in particular, just enjoying the act of looking. In the window of an antique shop, she spotted a collection of old postcards, black and white photographs of Edinburgh from decades past. She went inside to have a closer look. The shop smelled of old wood and dust, but in a pleasant way, as if it held the memory of many years. A slightly faded sign near the door read, "Please do not feed the antiques." Lyla smiled at that. The owner, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and reading glasses perched on top of his head, nodded to her from behind a desk stacked with books. Lyla browsed the postcards, running her fingers over the smooth, aged paper. One showed Princes Street in the 1920s, the road filled with trams and women in long coats. Another showed the castle in winter, snow covering its walls. She chose one showing the Royal Mile and took it to the counter. "Nice choice," the man said. "That's from the 1930s, I think. Look at the old shop fronts." Lyla studied the image again. The buildings looked much the same. but the signs and the people were entirely different. It was a glimpse into a version of the city that no longer existed, except in photographs like this. She tucked the postcard into her bag and left the shop, continuing her exploration of Stockbridge. The neighborhood felt relaxed and welcoming, less hurried than the city center. She passed a small park where children played on swings, their laughter ringing out, and a bakery where a queue had formed for fresh bread. Eventually, her wandering brought her back toward the Water of Leith. She found the pathway she'd seen earlier and descended a set of stone steps to reach it. The path was paved and smooth, running alongside the river beneath a canopy of trees. It was cooler here, shaded from the sun, and the sound of the water was soothing. Lyla walked slowly, in no particular hurry. The path was quiet, shared only with the occasional cyclist or dog walker. The river burbled over rocks, and in places, small waterfalls created gentle cascades. She passed beneath stone bridges, their arches covered in moss, and through sections where wildflowers grew in thick clusters along the bank. After a while, the path opened up, and she found herself near Dean Village, a small enclave of old buildings tucked into a valley. The village had an almost fairy tale quality: stone houses with steep roofs, cobbled streets, and an old mill building that had been converted into flats. Lyla crossed a bridge and walked through the village, admiring the way the buildings seemed to huddle together, as if protecting one another from the world outside. She found another cafe here, smaller than the last, with just a few tables inside and one bench outside. She ordered a coffee and sat on the bench, watching the river flow past. A family of ducks paddled by, the ducklings bobbing along behind their mother in a neat line. The coffee was strong and rich, and Lyla drank it slowly, letting the warmth spread through her. The afternoon light was beginning to soften, taking on a golden quality that made everything look slightly dreamlike. She thought about the day so far, the castle and the gardens, the grass market and the meadows, the quiet path by the river. Each place had offered something different, a different mood, a different way of seeing the city. When she'd finished her coffee, she walked back toward the city center, following the river path until it brought her near the foot of Calton Hill. She'd heard that the views from the top were worth the climb, so she began to ascend the gentle slope. The path wound upward through grass and low shrubs. Other people were making the climb as well. A couple holding hands, a man with a camera slung around his neck, a group of friends chatting as they walked. Lyla took her time, pausing now and then to catch her breath and look back at the view that was gradually revealing itself behind her. At the top, the hill opened into a wide, flat space dotted with monuments. There was the National Monument, its columns standing stark against the sky, and the Nelson Monument, a tall tower shaped like an upturned telescope. But Lyla was drawn to the edge of the hill, where she could look out over the entire city. Edinburgh spread below her in every direction. She could see the castle on its rock, the spires of churches, the green ribbon of the gardens, the rooftops of the new town laid out in orderly rows. Beyond the city, the land rolled away in shades of green and gold, and in the distance, the sea glittered in the late afternoon light. She stood there for a long time, the breeze tugging gently at her hair. A few other people stood nearby, also gazing out, but no one spoke. There was a shared understanding that this was a moment to be quiet, to simply take in the beauty of the place. Eventually, Lyla turned and made her way back down the hill, her legs slightly tired from the climb but her spirits light. She wandered back toward the old town, taking streets she hadn't explored yet, letting herself get pleasantly lost in the maze of closes and wins. She found herself on Victoria Street, a curved, cobbled lane lined with colorful shop fronts, red, yellow, blue, and green. The street sloped steeply downward, and Lyla walked slowly, peering into windows. There was a shop selling handmade soaps, another specializing in teas from around the world, and a quirky little place filled with vintage toys and curiosities. Near the bottom of the street, she passed a small gallery showing paintings of Scottish landscapes, rolling hills, misty lochs, and windswept coasts. She stepped inside for a moment, drawn by the soft colors and the sense of stillness in the images. A woman seated at a desk looked up and smiled but didn't interrupt Lila's browsing. Lyla moved from painting to painting, imagining the places they depicted. One showed a beach at dusk, the sand pale and smooth, the sea calm. Another showed a forest path, sunlight filtering through the trees. She lingered in front of a painting of a small stone cottage on a hillside, smoke rising from its chimney. It looked like a place where time moved slowly, where the loudest sounds would be the wind and the birds. She thanked the woman on her way out and continued down the street, eventually finding herself back in the grass market. The square was busier now, the cafes filled with people enjoying late afternoon drinks. Lyla found an empty table outside a cafe and sat down, grateful to rest her feet. A waiter appeared, a young man with an easy smile. "What can I get you?" "Just a sparkling water, please," Lyla said. He returned a moment later with a tall glass, ice clinking against the sides. Lyla sipped it slowly, watching the people around her. A group of friends at the next table were celebrating something. She could hear the clink of glasses and bursts of laughter. Across the square, a street musician had set up with a guitar and was playing a gentle melody that drifted over the cobblestones. Lyla leaned back in her chair, feeling pleasantly tired. The day had been full but not overwhelming, each moment unfolding at its own pace. She thought about the heron by the pond, the old postcards in the antique shop, the view from Calton Hill, small, quiet moments that had woven themselves together into something larger. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the square, Lyla finished her water and stood. She decided to walk back toward Waverley Station, not because she was ready to leave, but because she liked the idea of ending her day where it had begun. She retraced her steps through the old town, passing familiar landmarks, the shops on the Royal Mile, the entrance to Mary King's Close, the tall spire of the Scott Monument in the distance. The city felt different now in the evening light, softer somehow, more forgiving. When she reached Princess Street Gardens, she descended once more into the park. The gardens were quieter now, the earlier joggers and dog walkers replaced by couples strolling hand in hand and individuals sitting on benches, watching the light change. Lyla found a bench near a bed of roses and sat down. The flowers were in full bloom, their scent heavy and sweet in the still air. Above her, the castle was beginning to glow in the setting sun, its stone walls turned amber and gold. She sat there as the light slowly faded, not thinking about anything in particular, simply being present. A blackbird sang from a nearby tree, its song clear and unhurried. The air cooled, and Lyla pulled her cardigan a little closer around her shoulders. Eventually, she rose and made her way back toward the station. The streets were busier now, with people heading home from work or out for the evening. But Lyla felt separate from the rush, still moving at her own gentle pace. Inside Waverley Station, the departures board flickered with train times and platform numbers. Lyla checked the time and saw that she still had a while before she needed to think about leaving. She found a quiet corner near a window and sat down, watching the trains come and go, the travelers hurrying past with their luggage and their plans. Edinburgh had offered her exactly what she'd hoped for, a day of gentle exploration, of discovering both the well-known and the hidden, of moving through a city with curiosity but without urgency. She thought about the places she'd seen, the moments that had stood out. The heron, the view from the hill, the warmth of the scone, and the quiet of the river path. Outside the window, the sky was deepening to a soft purple, the first stars just beginning to appear. Lyla watched as the city lights came on one by one, the castle illuminated now against the darkening sky. It looked timeless, as if it had been watching over the city forever, and would continue to do so long after she was gone. She leaned her head back against the seat and let her eyes rest on the scene outside. The station hummed with its quiet, constant activity, but it felt distant, like white noise. Lyla felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her, the kind that comes from a day well spent, from having moved through the world with open eyes and an open heart. She would remember this day, she thought, not because anything extraordinary had happened, but because she had been fully present for all of it. The small joys, the quiet moments, the simple act of wandering through a beautiful city with nowhere she needed to be except exactly where she was. The station announcer's voice drifted over the loudspeakers, soft and measured, announcing arrivals and departures. Lyla closed her eyes for just a moment, holding on to the feeling of the day, letting it settle into her memory like a photograph carefully placed in an album. When she opened her eyes again, the city lights were glowing brighter against the night sky, and Edinburgh looked like something from a dream, ancient and enduring, yet somehow gentle, welcoming each person who passed through with the same quiet grace it had shown her today.